Welcome, everybody, from everywhere to today's roundtable on queer and democracy, LGBT struggles in Africa. I take it that I can be heard. I'm Melanie Judge from the University of Cape Town, amongst other spaces, and I'm absolutely delighted to be moderating this discussion with, I must say up front, three of my favorite queer thinkers, who I will introduce to you shortly, but you see already in the room. Let's start by providing a brief framing for the topic of this particular roundtable. The terms queer and democracy don't often appear alongside one another in academic conferences like this. Yet both queer struggle and democratic struggle are sites of social change and of political aspiration, which, to paraphrase Martin Luther King, I think enables that arc of the moral universe to bend that little bit more towards justice. Both the queer and the democratic can be wielded to challenge normative hierarchies of power and privilege that we know only too well are underpinned by inequalities related to racism, patriarchy, to heteronormativity, and to neoliberalism. And challenging these hierarchies of power draws necessary attention to the very precarious conditions that many of the sexual and gender margins continue to face. Today's roundtable centers on what LGBT struggles in Africa might bring to democracy, and in turn, how democracy features in and through these struggles. LGBT in Africa have not just been concerned with gaining rights and recognition. They've also been integrally linked to desires for dignity and equality, and for the dismantlement of historical and contemporary systems of domination and violence. So efforts to decriminalize same-sex sexualities and gender diversity on the continent are part and parcel of wider decolonization projects. In Ghana, for example, a despicable bill has been tabled in that parliament, a bill that in fact US right-wing reactionaries had a direct hand in drafting. We know also that penal codes that continue to criminalize LGBTI people in some African countries are hangovers of colonial orders that in some cases get revitalized through very problematic tropes of religion and of culture. LGBT struggles have been critical to expanding the idea of what democracy is. For example, the notion of inclusion helps us to interrogate normative assumptions about who belongs, about who counts as a citizen, and about whose life indeed has value and has a future. And I think this is fundamental to democratization itself, in that rights are claimed through citizenship, which in turn is linked to civic and political belonging, participation, and expression. In the African context, defending and advancing the rights of LGBTI persons is also centered on bringing about more democratic forms of governance, including by calling ruling elites to account for state-sponsored discriminations. This, of course, has also exposed how nationalism deploys homophobia and transphobia, often to shore up political power through the scapegoating of sexual and gender minorities. These, of course, are strategies that autocratic rulers across the world use in order to deflect attention away from very legitimate demands by their people for increased political accountability and reform. I also think that queer and trans activism is making a critical contribution to radicalizing democracy as both a concept and a practice. And here, the force of LGBT movements pushes us to reimagine what human rights and what justice mean in and for an African context. This too, of course, is a necessary alternative to Western liberal, often highly individualistic conceptions of what democracy is and what it should look like. So having said that, our panelists are going to build on and add to, and in some cases, hopefully contradict the themes that I've raised. And now let me introduce you to them in turn. And I'm just going to ask panelists, if they're not speaking, just to mute their mics. Thanks. So first of all, we've got Monica Tabengwa, who's a human rights lawyer and founder of Lgbts, which is an LGBTI organization in Botswana that drove the campaign in that country to decriminalize same-sex relations. Monica is currently a program specialist at the United Nations Development Program, working on the Inclusive Governance Initiative, which is a project that seeks to support countries in sub-Saharan Africa to become increasingly accountable to and inclusive of LGBTI communities. We also have in the house Matthyse, who's the Executive Director of Gender Dynamics, a trans-led and trans-specific human rights organization in Southern Africa. Identifying as a trans non-binary woman, Liberty holds a master's degree in law and is a leading voice in the trans movement, both here in South Africa and regionally. And then we also have Peace Kiguwa in the house, who's an associate professor in psychology at the University of Wits. Her research interests include critical social psychology, effective politics of gender and sexuality, racism and racialization, and the nuances of teaching and learning. And I do have to say that last week, Peace launched, or Professor Kiguwa, to keep in the protocols of academic conferencing, which I'm going to drop it to the side in a minute, but Professor Kiguwa launched a fantastic co-authored book titled Gender and Germs, Unmasking War Frames in South Africa's Militarized Response to COVID-19. So well done on that. It's a fantastic read. The format of today's roundtable, kind of square table more, is that I'm going to pose a series of questions to our panelists, and people will engage with them in turn. And then we're going to take questions from the audience. So I really invite you in the room to please post your questions in the Q&A box, and we will certainly get to them through the proceedings. So let's start with you, Liberty. Here in South Africa, I think one can argue that LGBTI individuals and organizations have the democratic space to make rights claims in quite a visible and quite a vocal way. And in your activism in doing just that, what are some of the ways in which queer and trans communities have challenged, even changed, dominant understandings of democracy, its institutions, and its practices?
Greetings, everyone, and thank you, Melanie, for the opening remarks. I think for when I think of democracy, it's really around our ability to meaningfully participate within the political, social, and economic spheres within a particular society, and everybody being able to participate without the fear of stigma, discrimination, or violence to that end. And so being able to embody a full autonomy over themselves, and of course how we navigate the world around us, being able to claim our gender identities, being able to claim our sexualities, being able to make informed decisions about our own bodies and what that looks like. And I think for us that is very important, and being able to rely on democratic institutions and the separation of power within this particular context has been pivotal in order for us to be able to make those rights claims. Where we've been unsuccessful with the executive or the legislature, we've often turned to the judicial arm in order to claim and of course vindicate our rights to that degree. And so I think to a broader extent, when we're looking at how we're queering democracy and what that means to us, it's really about shifting persons that's living on the margin of society, on the margins of society, to the center of society. And I think that for an organization like Gender Dynamics, we've been doing that in multiple ways. We have been championing visibility. And one key project, for example, that we've used is the Wall of Resilience, in being able to visibilize both the struggles, but also the resilient narratives of trans and gender diverse persons. So of course, take up space within the public arena and in educating and informing people that trans people exist, and of course, that trans people will continue existing, and therefore we need to make more rights claims within this particular context. We have been able to destabilize the idea that gender is binary that gender is fixed, and of course, that gender is associated with one sex that you are assigned at birth, in the sense that, and that of course informs our approach to advocacy in terms of how we see ourselves redefining the law and possibilities for change and possibilities for enhancing the quality of life that we are able to live. So one example of this would be really championing legal gender recognition on the basis of gender self-determination. We know that in the South African context, the medical community has a great deal of power that results in gatekeeping for transgender, diverse, and intersex communities within the country, within this context. And of course, oftentimes that leads to trauma through violent practices within these particular spheres. And so our approach is then to advocate and to champion a view that we should be able to change our gender markers without the need for medical evidence to prove that we are indeed who we say we are. In addition to that, I think what is also important, the fact that when we're looking at criminal law and hate crimes specifically, South Africa, despite our so-called progressive legal landscape when it comes to LGBTQI+ rights, we know that socially hate crimes remains a social evil that we need to contend with, and particularly with the spikes in hate crimes we've seen during COVID-19, just after relaxing of lockdown restrictions. And so in querying the law from that vantage point, it's really trying to insert definitions of what gender-based violence and femicide means and how that should be conscious of the lived realities of women, regardless of gender identity or sexual orientation. It also means that our court systems need to take into account the fact that a crime was committed on the basis of being informed by transphobia, homophobia, intersex phobia, etc. And so being able to see that the court reads in aggravating that as an aggravating circumstance to be able to increase the penalty imposed on the perpetrator. Then, of course, if we are looking at education in itself, being able to really reform or redefine the way in which teachers educate and engage within learning and teaching practices within the classroom, being able to look at how we shift the curriculum to be able to be reflective of trans and gender diverse persons and queer people more broadly. And of course, being able to look at policies, institutional policies, infrastructure to make sure that these particular spaces are conducive to the experiences and the lived realities of LGBTQI+ people broadly, but more importantly, trans and gender diverse persons. A very important, I think, topic of advocacy at this point in time that's being driven through the National Gender Diversity Coalition that has been established at the beginning of the year as a formal structure, is really ending in intersex genital mutilation, whereby we've seen the problematic conversation that unfolded between the Vice Chancellor of UCT and a urologist at Steve Biko Hospital, which highlighted really how deep, how far we still need to go in order to queer discourse within this particular country to get to a space where trans, gender diverse, intersex persons have full autonomy over our bodies to exist and to be and to love within this particular context. And so I think in all, from our end, when we're looking at queering democracy, it is really centering the individual, it is centering the community, and being able to ask the question, when we exist, are we able to exist without fear of stigma, discrimination, and violence? And do we have full autonomy and agency over our bodies and the spaces that we navigate? Because that is really the true tester to the extent to which we are embodying human rights to freedom, dignity, and equality.
Thanks, Liberty, very much for kicking us off, and I think really demonstrate how your work and the work of the trans community and gender dynamics in particular has been about occupying a multiplicity of spaces from the law downwards, in inverted commas, and really changing the terms of who this democratic subject is. And you get to the core of it when you say challenging the concept of what gender is, or this binary notion, as being absolutely critical to that. And I am relieved to say not to disappoint people, that we are not discussing the so-called science of LGBTI people in today's discussion. We're talking about the politics, the struggles, the lives. So thanks for bringing that in as well. Let's move across to you, Monica. In your very extensive experience in working on law and policy reform in a number of countries, how have you found that queer activists on the continent are using or invoking democratic tools and aspirations to assert rights? And how does that resonate with broader rights struggles in these arenas?
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you, Liberty, for that great start. So I'll just start by, stating what I think is also at the core of all our activism or our rights advocacy is really the desire to belong, to be part of a community. And so we look for inclusion, we look for equality, and most of all, we're looking not to be discriminated against, so for non-discrimination. And our from region to region across countries, but what we do know, unfortunately, is that LGBTI persons worldwide often meet refusal and denial from state representatives and from society when attempting and claim equal rights. Homophobia is ingrained in institutions and in societies. States use their authority and political might, or political weight, and society, through the power of tradition, really succeed to deny the diversity of sexual orientation and gender identity. So yeah, we basically have our work cut out for us, but what are we doing? How are we getting ourselves included? How are we making sure that we are part of this aspire to belong to? Liberty talked about some of the rights that we are looking for. And basically, that's the core. I mean, I think human rights is the core, fundamental human rights at the core of democracy. So we use those human rights as a standard or a measure of equality or non-discrimination. All countries constitutions, and in those constitutions, they have embedded bills of rights and signed various conventions, covenants, declarations, and so on and so forth. All of which obligate, respect, and fulfill those rights for all citizens without discrimination. So this aspect of where our democracy comes from. And it's not just for LGBTI persons. I think for all whose rights are fundamentally limited. International law are the basis from which our advocacy comes from. We know that rights are universal, indivisible, interdependent, and so the denial basically leads to denial of the other. And it is therefore that kind of measure of what democracy is, as described by Melanie and, of course, liberty. Has also shown that these rights are constantly, regularly contested. Their interpretations are different from everywhere. At the same time, more and more people have come to rely and often assert their rights when challenged. Doing that, the promotion of equality through the courts. So litigation has become an important tool for many and for LGBTI persons as well. And this litigation is primarily based on the quest for equality. So the equality is one which all the other rights flow out of. And all of our constitution cover equality. You can start from there. Where orientation is not mentioned in the constitution or in any law in any country, so long as the constitution refers to all persons being equal before the law, being, entitled to, able to assert that, you are entitled to such as a person living in that country. We've seen examples of different litigation strategies being adopted across the continent. In my own country, Botswana, there has been where LGBT groups have gone to court challenging the constitutionality of certain laws. That right, equality before the law, and they've been successful because of that. And the other thing that I think Melody mentioned is civic participation. It is another important right that democracy really demands. Democratization cannot be complete. People being able to participate, whether in politics, in governance, in all the spheres of life. The freedom of expression, being able to express yourself in various ways, the freedom to protest, the right to assemble, the freedom of association, the right to be able to come together as a unit or a subset to advocate for specific rights, equally important. The one thing that also has become very important is the building of coalition, movement building, being able to, whether it's locally, regionally, or internationally, being able to come together and talk about concerns and build that kind of group that can support each other and working across the intersection or working across movements, because at the end of the day, we are human beings, and it is not just one identity that we embody, we have several, and therefore it is important that we work with allies, we find the partners across movements, whether it's rights and so forth. Also, it is important, I know that, I've said that, fundamental human rights are equal, but at the same time, you realize political, people pay more attention to that. I think it is important as well to pay attention to, just access of basic services, particularly socioeconomic rights. We have SDGs, we have the processes that help us with that. And I think equally important to think about basic things like the right to housing, right to water, sanitation, environmental rights. And this is where we can work across with others to be able to come up, get into everything that we get into, to make sure that we access basic rights, especially when they are threatened in times like now with the COVID, threatening all the civil liberties. Particularly, I think social economic rights are coming under threat more and more. Shelter, food security, just general security are being attacked more and more. And people who are already on the margins are going to be impacted disproportionately. So these are some of the things that we are paying attention to, and we have to be very cognizant that the opposition is actually just as strong. They've got loads and loads of money. They are very organized, and they come up with very innovative ways to launch schemes and campaigns that cause backlash that lasts for generations. And so we have to be just as organized to come up with schemes that can counter all these narratives and alive, important, and present and seen. I think I've run out of time, have I? Yeah. Anyway, I will provide more, I think.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Monica. Just so you're aware, you're coming and going a little bit, so maybe you can try and move around and get a slightly stronger connection for the next round. But I really just wanted to pull out one thing that you'd mentioned that I think is really interesting and critical, and that is you were saying rights are contested, and I think that that contestation is also within so-called LGBTIQ community. So part of the struggle is making meaning of kind of pushing the boundaries of what the rights discourse itself can actually enable or not. And hopefully that's something we can pick up on later. Let's move across to you, Peace. As in planning for this roundtable, one of the things that we were discussing as a collective is just this notion that democracy, of course, means different things to different people. And it is itself a contested concept. So with this in mind, and from your perspective and your work, how can we critically interrogate its meanings, and particularly how those meanings might frame sexuality and gender in ways that are, on the one hand, productive and also at the same time troubling? What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Melanie, and hello to everyone listening. So I want to actually try answer your question by picking up or piggybacking on what Monica has just left off on, which is the idea of organizing. And part of what I want to say is I agree that in the way that we think about conservative camps who organize very diligently in terms of the oppression and marginalization of LGBTI plus communities, I think we also need to be very vigilant about how we organize. And one of the things that I would propose is that I think sometimes we can learn from what has gone before. So if we think about the ways that feminists organizing, but in particular African feminist organizing, has provided us with a toolkit in terms of thinking about how we think about social organizing and responses. That's one of the ways that we can think about that. So I'm piggybacking on that to also piggyback on something else that has been coming up in the conversations. And because I am located in psychology, part of my work has centered around not just trying to unravel the kind of effects and functions of power and violence in society, but also thinking about not just the structural, but thinking about the psychopolitics of power, thinking about the psychopolitics of violence, and thinking about the psychopolitics of freedom. Because I think we don't talk enough about that. We talk about structural forms of intervention, state intervention, and all of that. But I think we need to attend to the psychology of all of these different dimensions. So having said all of that, your question about democracy is in fact a very interesting one, because I think it's not just a contested concept, it's also a very taken for granted concept. So you throw the word democracy out to anyone, they will already assume they know what you were talking about. So we have an idea about what democracy is and what its parameters should look like. And because we take this for granted, we don't do enough of the work of continually reimagining and reinvigorating our language of democracy and what that could mean. Because I don't think it's immutable. I don't think it remains the same. It's not fixed. Having said all of that, I think one of our best markers for democracy is trying to think about rights, as Liberty and Monica have mentioned, and to think about what it means when a state chooses to withdraw rights from segments of its population and citizenry. So I think we can start there as one of the best benchmarks of thinking about democratic states. And if we think about the withdrawal of rights, that means we need to seriously think about what we mean or we understand by human rights, because that's also another taken for granted concept. So we need a conversation around that. And that for me means that we need a other kind of benchmark for thinking about democracy. And as Liberty has mentioned, as Monica's mentioned, it's the recourse to law. We need to be able to have recourse to law. That's the bottom line. So in the face of denial of rights, in the face of dehumanization of a citizenry, the question is, who can we turn to? And this is, for me, is the first barometer. This is what makes us able to put governments and states to account. So we need accountability in that way. And I think that's another key benchmark for that. But I also think that if democracy means thinking about human rights, if it means having the recourse to law, then I think we should not stop just at legal protection. I think legal protection is fundamental, no doubt. But I also think we need to start talking about the freedom to live, the freedom to love, the freedom to have access to health, to education, amongst other things. And so to broaden the way that we think about democracy and democratic states. And so for me, it's three things. It's thinking about the absence of rights. It's thinking about the absence of a legal recourse to law in the face of the denial of these rights. But it's also thinking about the presence of democracy. So if you think about a context such as South Africa, where we have constitutional rights that are entrenched, so you have a presence of democracy of sorts. So how do we still talk about the ways that queer lives still do not matter, even in the presence of these kinds of rights? How do we talk about the ways that queer lives still experience limitations of freedom? And so that for me is the fundamental thing. We need to think about the kind of legal state elements to thinking about rights and democracy, but we also need to think about the other kinds of invisible elements to democracy. And so part for me, I think the tension is, at the very least, it's in the ways in which we frame sexual and gender rights, and thinking about that in terms of legal protection, but also thinking about the tension with cultural beliefs and practices, right? And I think part of that tension is the way that the kind of debates that we've witnessed over the years has unfolded. So thinking about cultural rights and thinking about individual rights or group rights, and trying to truly get to the heart of the tension of this. And I think part of the work that then needs to happen with troubling democracy, not just as concept, but also the language of democracy, is that we need to not just trouble the legal spheres of democracy. We also need to trouble this conflation, this attachment of beliefs and practice, and how that enmeshes within the law. Because here's the thing, I think if the ideal citizen, or if the ideal citizen subject is imagined within the law in a particular way, I think we also need to attend to the way that such an imagination also exists within civil society, within the cultural sphere, and how these are not separate, but are in fact reinforcing of each other. So legal protection and recourse to the law is one part of the struggle. I think there's other parts of the struggle that need attending to, that is part of thinking through what democracy could look like and could mean. The other thing for me is that sex has always been, we know this, sex has always been political. And so when we have conversations about gender, sex, sexuality, we need to think about the kind of histories of this as well. African sexualities and genders have been caught up in a kind of political maneuvering that is also very full of subterfuge. So there are moments when we have this eruption, right, in the debate and the conversation. So the framing of democracy by many African leaders across the continent engaged with this subterfuge and this kind of maneuvering. And so for me, part of the kind of thinking through about the meanings and the framing of gender and sexuality, and how we can think about more troubling or less troubling and more productive kind of ways, means we need to attend to this kind of conflation and the kind of broader discourses around African identities and authenticity. So to kind of summarize all of that, to trouble democracy, I think is part of the project. And we need to think about the different legs of what this work can entail. It's about thinking through state and the actions of the state. It's about thinking through legal protection and the capacity, the the kind of capacity to access a recourse to law in the face of a denial of human rights. But I think we also need to kind of rescue culture, amongst other things. Lgbts talked about the rescue of gender, and I think we need to insert culture in all of this as well. We need to rescue the way that culture has been trapped into a kind of framing that essentializes gender and sexualities. And to not separate this, because I think they are simultaneously the same kind of problem. Because there is a language that makes it possible for the law to recognize certain citizens as un-African because of their sexual orientations and practice. That makes it possible to frame these citizens and subjects as a threat to our way of life. And so we need to attend to that. The way the un-African sexually depraved subject is able to emerge right alongside cultural discourses, and how that also then reinforces or is reinforced within conversations about the law and state responses. Thank you.
Thanks, Peace. As always, just, stretching, our capacities to trouble the terms that we often find great comfort in. And I think just two things that really struck me is, one, this kind of recourse, this call, this turn to law as savior, as freedom, as possibility, as you say, in the absence of rights, and then this invocation of rescuing culture. And I just wonder, often we even think of those two things as absolutely mutually exclusive, the relationship between culture and law, when in actual fact, the way that life is lived, it isn't in that bifurcated way that law sits here and culture sits there, although certain forms of nationalism would like us to believe so, and certain forms of activism as well. And I think that's a massive challenge at the intersection with sexuality. So thanks for that. I'm going to swing back to Monica. Monica, it's as we know in some of the work that we're doing together at the moment, it's no coincidence that kind of anti-woman and anti-LGBTIQ discourses are frequently advanced by leaders who are autocratic, leaders who are undemocratic, unaccountable to their populace. In your work and activism, particularly in more hostile environments, how have issues of shrinking civic space and participation impacted efforts to hold states and their laws and their leaders to account?
Thank you, Melanie. So as I think all the speakers, including myself, civic participation is a fundamental principle of democratization. Individuals must be able to express their opinions freely. They must be able to come together to advocate for issues that affect them, be able to assemble or protest without fear of harassment or arrest. Yet we know that civic space is constantly under pressure. Society organizations are regarded with suspicion and are often actively attacked non-state actors. We have seen a proliferation of anti-NGO laws being passed by autocratic states. We have seen some more arbitrary administrative actions, inspections, audits on NGOs, harassment and criminalizations, being used by states to basically limit the space. I can give examples. We've seen in Uganda in the last 10 years, especially copying from Russia propaganda laws to limit the existence and the operations of NGOs. Recently, there is a new law being advocated for in Ghana, also along the lines of the propaganda laws coming out of Russia, Nigeria, and Uganda, basically to limit the space to harass NGOs, particularly LGBTI NGOs. We've seen in Ethiopia and many other countries, you know, laws prohibiting NGOs from receiving resources or funding foreign funding, in order to keep their operations going on. So, you know, the way that they've done it, sometimes it's very clever in the sense that some of these laws are really, if you just read them, they look very innocuous. They don't look dangerous at all, but because of how they are applied selectively and arbitrarily, that's where the discrimination comes in. They are very vague, especially the administrative parts of the law around registration, for instance, where it would be something like in the public interest or in the interest of morality, without defining exactly what those mean. And when LGBT organizations apply for registration, they are denied based on those very vague. So it's in the interpretation of very vague and arbitrary laws, deliberately to exclude certain organizations. That happens, and so we know what the denial of registration can do to an organization being able to operate, be able to work in a space. And in some other spaces, they use the same to kind of, extra legal actions to threaten like deregistration of organizations that have registered through other ways and maybe calling themselves gender activists. And we've seen in Zimbabwe, several years ago when the constitution was being debated, that's exactly what happened, was to threaten girls and others with deregistration. And the same would happen in Uganda. And so these are some of the ways that governments use, to kind of use the laws and regulation to limit the work and the space that organization can work. And issues around how to apply for permits to protest, to assemble. And this it has even become more pertinent nowadays with all the states of emergencies and what have you with COVID. Those arbitrary or vague provisions have kind of, they found power in the sense that they are being used right now to stop any kind of, coming together. We've seen arrests in different countries. We've seen harassments of organizations under the guise of these kind of administrative regulations, basically to limit the ability of organizations to come together and be visible and be seen and advocate for certain things. Arrests, I think it of course it brings fear, and especially once you're arrested, what happens to you when you are in detention. We've heard of very egregious human rights violations of people, anal examinations, being carried out on people without their consent, and that's those things that surely would basically make you think twice about going to a meeting in a country where it's possible that police could intervene. There is also a deliberate, I think, action by government to mislabel, or to label organizations working on certain topics, whether it could be women's rights, abortion rights, or LGBTI. They might call them foreign agents, or just really names that create a negative narrative. And so that would stigmatize, and that basically means, you know, people are less and less able to come out and be seen and want to be involved in that way. And I mean, you know, this kind of, you know, these violations, of course, they affect human rights. At the end of the day, it's about equality. It's about equal protection of the law, all the human rights. As I said before, you know, the denial of one affects all of them because they are interdependent. So you take out one, you deny the others. So as soon as you arrest people, it means, you know, the civic space is narrowed. You know, every time you harass people, you know, every time the regulation or the limitations, the weakening of all of this affects the other, you know, and it works both ways. The violation of human rights affects the spaces that they are able to go to. And so, you know, I think, again, you know, we have to think about, we have to constantly be ahead of ourselves, you know, work ahead of, you know, anticipate what is going to come, especially, like I said, you know, the opposition, especially, you know, those working around family values, those working, the religious opposition, they have a lot of resources and they are able to bring huge campaigns, and they find friendship in country with political representatives that are seeking to use the populist you know, sentiments to further themselves. And so, I mean, I think we constantly have to refine our techniques. We have to use everything that is available to us. The social media has become a vehicle in many instances to really get ahead and kind of counter the lack of physical space, finding a virtual space to work. But even that, you know that it can be used to head to stigmatize and to do all kinds of damages. We've seen people being arrested in all kinds of countries, people being taken advantage of and extorted through social media. And so, but I think, you know, at the end of the day, we can, and we've seen progress happen because we are able to organize. We are able we have been able to create the critical mass by finding champions and finding, you know, champions with in the African Commission, the Human Rights Council, the General Assembly, within countries, finding the religious leaders who are able to use their own spaces to be able to speak from their podiums and open space and include. And so I think, you know, there are challenges and they might appear to be insurmountable, but I think as we work together across movements, realizing that, you know, it's not just one identity. We are an embodiment, the sum of all parts, you know, and working together with all the other organizations, I think progress will happen slowly, but, you know.
Thanks. Thanks, Monica. And I think, you know, importantly, giving us kind of the broad sweep of the range of, you know, attacks and machinations and the machinery that actually, you know, excludes, marginalizes, oppresses. And I think it's really important in an academic space like this to speak about that politics on the ground, what's actually happening to people's lives in particular contexts, and the kind of determination which with certain lives are maintained superfluous or without value, or etc. So just the way, you know, those operations really at the macro level, at the structural level, and how they directly impact people's lives directly. And I want to bring you in, Liberty, because you started us there in a sense. You started us in the frame violence and having to push back against normative ideas, even of what it is to be a gendered individual. And so I'm wondering, in the mix of points that have been made, like, does democracy matter in the face of these kind of deep attacks and deep inequalities that prop that up and that continue to shape the lives and the deaths of LGBTI people in this continent and elsewhere? I mean, does it matter? Why does it matter? How does it link to ambitious ideas around freedom, around, so what are your thoughts on that?
Sure, Melanie. I think democracy certainly matters, just from the vantage point of presenting an opportunity for human rights realizations, and of course being able to achieve some level of social equity, social justice, gender equity within society. And I think that what we've historically found and still see as great value is the fact that the separation of the legislature, the administration, and of course the judicial arm. And again, being able to say that in all instances where the former two failed us in terms of not passing law, policy, and enacting that in a way, implementing that in a way that translates into furthering social justice and human rights for the community, we've turned to the court system in order to provide us with an opportunity to get our rights vindicated. And I think there's been a very important case within the South African context, which is the September versus Subramani case around a transgender woman of color that was imprisoned for being in conflict with the law. And so where there were no regulations, there was no law necessarily affirming her rights within this particular context, we've had to go to court and say, listen, but despite this person's gender marker not having been changed with the Department of Home Affairs, it does not give you the right to label her and to humiliate her by using gender pronouns that's associated with the sex that she was assigned at birth. So on you, there is a obligation to affirm a gender identity, regardless of what her legal particulars are saying, and allow her the ability to be able to express herself through the wearing of jewelry, minimal makeup, within these centers to express a gender identity, and also make a decision about where she would want to be detained, whether that would be in a women's facility or in a male facility, depending on what she believes would be in her own best interest from a safety and security vantage point. So really centering the person in decision-making about what's going to be best for them under certain circumstances. So I think for us, we really see the value in striving for democratic ideals such as this, to be able to really embed our rights and our claims to rights, and then of course hopefully achieve some level of a tipping point at some point in the future where it becomes incredibly difficult to reverse those rights. And so that of course is a level of sustainability. I want to touch on a point that Monica also raised earlier on around this distinction between, and I think to some degree it's also something that's relevant within the global north vis-a-vis the global south types of discussions around the civil political, the distinction between the civil political and the socioeconomic rights that accrues to us. We know that in a country such as South Africa, again with a very progressive legal framework on LGBTQI+ rights, it doesn't always translate into substantive equality. It doesn't always translate into feeling that you can act with freedom, feeling that you are safe and secure. Our hate crime statistics is testimony to this. And so really troubling the idea of what does it mean to participate within a democratic space like this, where socioeconomic liberation remains out of reach of many, because we know that access to socioeconomic opportunities and resources often also gives us the opportunity to enforce our civil political rights within these particular realms. And so I think really trying to trouble the extent to which we are comfortable with the status quo for what it is, and the extent to which we need to pose difficult and hard questions to those in power of leading a democratic society around what type of solutions are being produced, are forthcoming in order to really breach the socioeconomic divide that exists, and particularly the fact that it disproportionately affects those who are more marginalized. To the point around intersectionality, for example, and here we can speak from the vantage point that different people are oppressed differently within society, and that is true. We all experience oppression differently, but I think to some degree we can also acknowledge that some people experience marginalization, exclusion, violence to a greater degree than others based on where we are located within society. And I think the democracy presents us with the opportunity to highlight those intersecting spaces of oppression, whereby when we step into a room, we are stepping in with so many different identity characteristics that shape who we are, and we are oppressed with each one of them in different ways. For example, if you are a trans woman of color living in a rural context that is currently formally unemployed, that it has turned to sex work as a form of generating an income, that is HIV positive with tuberculosis lurking in the background, how is our democracy responding to that? Not only as Peace has indicated earlier on, through the legal realm and legal remedial action by what's on paper, but actually translating that into actual tangible responses that we can use in order to enhance the quality of life of the people that are most affected within these particular spaces. And here we are speaking access to health, access to shelter, access to legal support, legal gender recognition. In 2019, Gender Dynamics had a regional conference, and the conference was aptly named Recognition, Protection, Access, Solidarity. And so when we are looking at what we need in terms of advancing, we need to be able to respond to all of those questions around recognition, questions around protection, questions around access, and of course, questions around how do we define solidarity within spaces? How do we support the causes that we are fighting and bring and represent each other's causes at the table in order to collectively move forward and advance a particular human rights agenda that speaks to the liberation of everyone within a particular country context, and of course within the global context at large.
Thanks very much, Liberty, and perhaps pushing forward on this point around solidarities, both inside a broad movement and then, of course, beyond that movement. I want to loop back to you, Peace. I mean, one of the terms that you used in our early discussion around this roundtable was this notion of an African-centered democracy or democratic imaginary, and in thinking about what might constitute that and its implications for livability in this place, in this time, for Black livability, for queer livability. What do you think are some of the questions that activists and scholars working or with an interest in sexual and gender justice should be grappling with in relation to this African-centered democratic imaginary?
That's a tough question to answer, and that's because there's many. I think there needs to be a kind of multi-pronged approach here. So I'm going to try to think through some very basic ones. But because you flagged the idea of African-centered imaginary, I want to start there by thinking about imaginations, right? And I think one of the things that we often think about when we talk about the idea of imaginations is that we think about imaginations in all of its positive meanings. And for a moment, I want to talk about a negative meaning to imagination and what's been referred to as wicked imagination. Because I think we need to start asking, what is it that imaginations do? And if imaginations can build to recognize solidarities and build coalition and to work towards the honoring of every citizen's rights in any country, I think imaginations may also work to destroy, to dehumanize. And so we need to think about the ways that the current status of queer rights across the continent is in many ways held up by wicked imagination. And so what that means for me is that as part of reclaiming of imagination and what imagination can do in terms of building rights, building solidarities, honoring the basic humanness of each one of us. So to reclaim an African-centered imagination means that we also have to acknowledge that an African-centered imaginary has been co-opted, and it's been co-opted by wicked imagination. And we know this. The discourse about this is un-African, this is not our culture, it feeds off of that. So part of that reclaiming is the work that we need to do. I think the other work we need to do is that we need to seriously start thinking about what it means to be Africans and what does Africa actually mean? Because the way that we have distorted the meanings of this has fed into the kinds of dehumanizations that we're seeing here. And so I think that's part of our work. But I think part of the other work is that we need to build counter narratives. Our contexts are different, our lives are different, our experiences of gender and sexuality is different. We need to build narratives, an archive of sorts that allows us to explore how we make meaning of our lives as sexual and gender communities. Sylvia Tamale has also talked about the way that we take for granted particular kinds of languaging in the struggle for rights. Human rights is one of those concepts we take for granted. And I think we need to acknowledge that it's not an easy transposing to different contexts across the continent. We need to talk about the ways that we think about human rights very differently. And so what approaches can work for us in our context? And that is a project that needs to be taken on board. But I really like the idea of coalition building. And one of the things I will say is that we cannot afford single issue politics. We need to build coalition across. And this for me is part of the limits of identity politics. So that's very key. And lastly, I would say that the legal frameworks that we are pushing for must also be read in relation to capitalist and patriarchal states. And if we acknowledge that these states are not interested in the protection of women and sexual and gender minorities' rights, then we need to ask, how can we rely on these states to inform for us what human rights needs to look like? So that's part of our project.
Fantastic, and it's a huge project piece. I hope God it doesn't only rest on the shoulders of LGBTIQ people, otherwise we're in trouble. I'd like to move across to the Q&A and the chat, and again, just an invitation to our large audience to throw out your questions. There was one question in the chat, and I'll throw it out. It's from Susan. Are we only looking for inclusion? Also, do we need to move beyond a discourse of belonging? Included in what? Belonging to what? Or are we rather looking for ways to challenge oppression and to decrease stroke, eradicate exploitation in all its guises? Liberty, do you want to perhaps respond to that?
I think just looking at it through the lens of reaching gender equity within society, and of course, and how that is relevant to trans and gender diverse persons, it is really for us about breaking the mold altogether. But we also need to be conscious of the external environment and what becomes possible in any given historical moment. And so if we are saying we are looking at law reform with regards to legal gender recognition, what does that law reform process look like? So we had a couple of options. The one was it's to demedicalize the Alteration of Sex Description and Sex Status Act, which still speaks to the issue of inclusion, but just giving us a little bit more leeway and freedom to be able to claim our recognition through legal means. Second to that, we had the option of how do we then broaden the definition of gender, which takes us a little bit more towards a progressive way of looking at gender equity. And so that could be through the introduction of a third category, gender X unspecified. On the other end of the spectrum, we could look at it through the lens of, so how do we create a society where gender does not matter? and doesn't carry that much weight, which is, of course, if we're looking at the external environment, could be perceived as being a very radical stance to push. And so I think for us, we as a civil society organization, we're very much caught in the space of what becomes practically feasible here and now, and that can translate into greater recognition and protection. And of course, what would be a no-go zone and would be shut down immediately once it reached the public or once it reached parliament for purposes of debate, etc. So I think it's a very difficult question to answer. From where I am sitting, one would want to go very radical and really radically transform gender discourse, but we are constrained by the external political and social environment.
Liberty, and you and I have often spoken about that, how, in that moment of getting closer to power and having an opportunity to engage in potentially shaping shifts of law, of policy, there's always a risk of being domesticated, of one's politics becoming sanitized, and our more radical projects being diluted, and that's the real politics that one is frequently straddling. There's another question I want to pull out from the Q&A box, and Monica, you might want to have a stab at this. It's from Kwezi, who says, noting the limitations of democracy in protecting queer rights, how can organizers or even the state itself help mitigate violence against the queer body in the face of greater society's intolerance? And then they say, I ask this question because I'm reminded by how organizers and the state embarked on powerful media campaigns in helping educate society about HIV and AIDS. Your thoughts?
Yeah, we often do that. I'd like to just start by just responding a little bit to the question that Liberty answered, and just basically reiterating the fact that what Peace spoke about in talking about the imagination, and as an activist, a lot of the time we do have aspirations, and we big, and oftentimes when we come to practice it, we become desperate. We are reacting to actions that threaten lives, threaten our ways of living, that threaten our families, and we are forced to be practical. And I think hence the low-hanging fruit, in order to really get the basic survival tools to be able to be there tomorrow to face another challenge. I think that's the difficulty in being able to think about the aspirations of democracy when you live within a government that pushes in the opposite, that doesn't want to face its responsibilities to protect, to fulfill. Right. And so I think it has to be a constant contestation. You have to constantly challenge these concepts and push the limits as far as you can. And so long as you're able to do this and sustain it. And I think that's it becomes very basic in that sense, that we want, but we will do it incrementally as it allows, a bit at a time, until we get to what we can. And so I think the answer, Susan, I think we come from all directions and use everything that is available to us to be able to attack. Academics do what they can. Activists do what they have to do. Lawyers, we go to court and we argue legal arguments and so on and so forth. And I think that we recognize that it is, we have to bring everything together and their opportunities and the powers that they possess wherever they are sitting at. to come to this. The question around, democracies are failing. And I think what I said before, we have to be constantly evolving as practitioners, as activists, as workers here. We have to be constantly thinking about different ways to achieve that. Just getting laws and getting the judgments in court doesn't achieve the change we.
Monica, we've just lost you. I think it's a connectivity issue.
I've spoken of concentrating on working with economic and social rights. That it's very important that we really concentrate on making sure that we bring to book
Monica, no, we actually can't. So I'm just going to hold it there while you try and figure out your wiring, because we've lost you good and proper. And we'll swing back to you in a minute or so, if that's okay, once we've got your face back on screen. I wanted to pick up on another question that's come through from Toko. And Peace, maybe you want to give a go at this, because I know you've done work in this area, specifically under the Psychological Society of South Africa, where you're chair of the Sexuality and Gender Division. And Toko says, I'm curious to know how the three speakers view the school curriculum in relation to the need to African-centered queerize rights and democracy. I like the verbing of queer, to queerize. So what are your thoughts?
I'm trying to get to the heart of the question. So there seems to be quite a number of things there. It's thinking through the kinds of conversations we've been having in South Africa, in particular, around decolonization of the curriculum. And I think part of that conversation has not only centered around tertiary higher education context, but thinking about how we teach for diversity and in diversity at a school level. And part of that thinking through of the curriculum has not only just centered around sexual and gender diversity, but also thinking through other canons of knowledge that include that now include African-centered knowledge, and so it's a difficult one to answer in some ways. I think in some respects, what you have is working through the concept of diversity, whether it's sexual or gender diversity, or cultural diversity, and working through those concepts in ways that I think these concepts have been predominantly taken up, which is in the sense of a very cosmetic kind of way. And to kind of piggyback to Susan's earlier question around inclusion, so we need to be very careful about these concepts. So we need to think about the way that diversity work seems to do the work of sustaining the status quo, ironically. And we use the language of diversity as a way to make visible, but at the same time, what do we do in terms of that visibilizing? And I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we've kind of unraveled precisely what it is that is unfolding as we engage with diversity in these kinds of ways. So in principle, I welcome that, but I think we also need to be very vigilant about the ways in which curriculum is being reimagined and thought through. And so to kind of answer Susan's earlier question around inclusion, I think because we have been given a language to think through how we respond to human rights violation. And one of the concepts in this language is the idea of equality or inclusion. And so I would say we need to be strategic about how we respond here. I think we can work with that. I think we can use that as a way to respond and speak back to. But I don't know that I am aiming for equality. I don't think that's my end goal. I think other people might feel differently about that. Inclusion is not something that I strive for in that sense, but I recognize that it is a tool, or it's a language that I can use as a way to challenge a denial of human rights. And so part of what I think we need to also think about is, what do we want in place of equality? And part for me, to return to the African-centered response, is that I think there has always been a language for us. There has always been a philosophy and a practice for us that has existed in African philosophy and in African feminist theorizing. Across the continent, we have the similar language for this, and we think about it in different kinds of ways. Here in South Africa, we call it Ubuntu. And we need to start thinking about not just the kind of cosmetic ways that we talk about this kind of concept, but to think about, well, what would it mean for us to reclaim this idea of community and to reclaim that as part of social legal transformation. So to seriously start thinking about the translation into law. This for me is this is where we want to move. So for the moment, I will sit with equality, but that's not my end goal. And I think that's the same response I would give to thinking through the curriculum as well. By all means, let's change the curriculum and let's think through diversity, but let's be very careful about the way that diversity can work in very apolitical ways.
And of course, it's also part of how these terms are wielded and the kinds of meaning making, that part of the struggle is determining the meaning, in a sense. That's contesting the meaning of the very concepts that one is mobilizing maybe to advance certain agendas. And I think that's really important, is not taking those terms as given, as granted, kind of deploying them in a much more strategic way. And then to your point, Peace, keeping that imagination alive. And I think that's the difficulty when one's at the coal face of certain kinds of struggles that are really about the materiality of life, about access to basic resources, about access to basic conditions of livability. And then we're talking about imagination, which of course academics just completely love. So it is also about critical imaginations that are bound to place and time and that look different depending on where one is positioned. I'm hoping we'll be able to get Monica back, because Monica, wherever you are in cyberspace, we're missing you. So if our technological fantastic supporters can try and help with that, that would be fantastic as we draw to the last 10 minutes of the session. Interesting question from Nomalanga in the Q&A thread that I want to read out, and maybe Liberty, you want to give a go at this. A contentious question is, how does the material reality of sex biology and women's reproductive labor, especially poor women, work out if there's a total eradication of sex politically, e.g. like race blindness? And then Nomalanga goes on to say, and I know this is a huge question in the UK right now, at hand is, how can the debate happen given the very lived realities of sex reproduction labor that society must keep in mind? So sex, biology, reproduction, and the politics of that. Your thoughts?
So I think in terms of looking at it again through the law reform process that we are trying to get underway, and looking at the three options that I was speaking about earlier on, sex and gender does matter for different reasons within society. I think that the way in which it has been also mobilized and weaponized against certain gender minority groups within society has been very problematic. And so the question is, how do we redefine our understanding of gender and sex in a way that doesn't seek to marginalize, doesn't seek to invisibilize and erase, and of course doesn't seek to perpetuate violence against a particular community? And so I don't necessarily I'm not going to be taking a particular stance on this, on the question or the statement. I do think that we need to think through it a little bit more and see how do we balance the interest of different communities in relation to people's continued investments within sex and gender discourse within at the society level, but also at an individual level. And I think once we are able to also invest in greater movement building, solidarity finding, and of course collectivizing our efforts and be able to dialogue with one another, some of these solutions will be forthcoming in terms of how we hold that complexity in context of sex and gender discourse. I think we're not doing enough of that at the moment, and for us that is really an important area that we further want to explore. But of course, gender and sex both are political, and they serve particular purposes for the individual and collectives. Yeah, I'm going to park it there without giving a concrete answer, but raising a question and perhaps posing a next step for us as an organization invested in sex and gender discourse.
I mean, to that question, I can't help but think about yesterday's keynote addressed by Professor Mamdani, who seemed quite horrified at the prospects of the killing off of women in response to a comment I had made about misogyny as a slow genocide. I mean, of course, what on earth would men do without us was sort of what I thought maybe had come up. And in some ways, I think the materiality of sex and reproduction does its own essential, in the double meaning of the word, essential work. And I think part of the challenge for us is to destabilize that essential work that it does, and to think about what at the same time it does to certain bodies and keep certain bodies in particular social, economic, and political place, if you like. So I think it's a very interesting question. Thanks for that. Just having a look. Oh, okay, Monica's back. Monica, anything, you've sort of been in and out, anything and you were mid-sentence when we lost you. Do you want to come in on any reflections at this point from what you've heard? You're on mute.
Yeah, apologies for this, hiccup. It's been raining. I can only blame it on that, although we need the rain. Before I disappeared, I think I was talking about the failing of democracy. And what I was trying to kind of say is basically, a lot of the time we just, I think we need to be ahead in so many different ways, and find innovative ways to respond and push the spaces and find those little pockets, where there are opportunities to be able to get in and stay in. I think it's not just get in and leave. I think stay in and bring the right people, a diversity of people, not just one-dimensional. I think sometimes we can be our own enemies in the sense that we kind of do a lot of gatekeeping as well. We want to be the only voices to be heard and the only people to be seen. And we are reproducing in some ways our own governments in that sense, because of course being at the table means you have more opportunities for whether it's work, funding, credibility. But I think in order to succeed and get your voice through, and the different voices, and like we've said, we are not the same, and we should not allow anyone to ever brush us with the same paint or paint us with the same brush. We are women with disabilities, living with HIV, women of color, and so on and so forth. And I think, the representation is important. I think, representation is important in that sense that, it allows everyone to be heard and the interpretations to be also as diverse as we are. And, just go into all these the different platforms. I believe it is important to work at the UN, in as much as we see it. We know its faults, we know its failings, and we know how exclusive it can be. It is important to be there because that's where a lot of the rights are framed. The basic frameworks are built there, and so we have to be there to contribute to the beginning and not just come in at the end, to the building of whether it's a convention or declaration. It can be a hard law, a soft law, just be present at the African Commission. As hard as it can be, we have to be there. In religious institutions, we have, I think, a lot of, right now, we have more religious institutions or religious leaders coming out with negative interpretations of whether it's the Bible or Quran or whatever other text is available. But we also have, in the midst of that, champions, and we have people ourselves, people of faith, who are in our communities. We need to promote those. We need to support, provide a counter narrative of solutions, and the solutions must be owned by Africans. And a lot of it, we need to build the knowledge here locally, and not have someone come and build it or come and take the knowledge and leave with it. I think we need to build it. We need to own it. We need to distribute it, decide on how it's used and distributed. And I think that those are different ways to claim those spaces and claim, that you're part of the solution, you're part of this democracy, claiming those rights and actually contribute on how those rights are protected and how they are even defined. And so for me, it's all basically, making sure that the skills are here and the skills are sustained, people's livelihoods are sustained. And I wanted to emphasize on the work around social and economic rights. And I think this is where the basic, sustaining communities, sustaining individuals is important, because we're talking about food security, shelter, water, very basic things that everybody needs. And because a lot of our communities live in the margins, they find themselves lacking, especially in those aspects. And I think it's something that where we basically need to concentrate our efforts to be able to get to, coming out, being open. You can't when you don't have food, you don't have the job, you don't have shelter. The basic things are the most important, to be able to do all the other also important things to, being part of a democratic society.
Thank you. Thanks, Monica. We've come to the end of the session, and I do just want to say two things. One, really to thank Liberty and Peace and Monica for such a rich and thoughtful conversation, and to all of you for the great questions and reflections on what we've discussed. We're a little experimental in this roundtable because I think we wanted to destabilize these separate spaces of activists and academics. And so in a sense, I think what it allowed us to do is to be true to the title of the conference, which is to fracture the conversation, speaking on different terms through different narratives from different places. And the big challenge is how do we bind futures out of these fractured conversations and these fractured times that we're living in. And that's, I suppose, the weight that's on all of our shoulders, whether we're activists, scholars, or a bit of both. So thanks very much to my friends and comrades on the screen in front of me whose faces I can see, and thanks to all of you whose faces we can't see. And I think we're breaking now, and then it's over to the next session. Thanks very much, everyone.
And thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks to you, Melanie, Monica.
Thanks all.
Thank you so much, everybody. That was really a wonderful discussion. And our next session will be at 5 o'clock, our keynote address, our second keynote address by Professor William Gumede, and he'll be speaking on Mandela, Mbeki, and Zuma, contrasting approaches to nation building. So please join us at that time.